afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Winter, and I work with Trek 10. So we are hiring. We do mostly serverless professional services, so we focus in the serverless space. We have some other opportunities as well, but feel free to talk to me after, or I have a couple folks that work with me here in the back as well. So without further ado, I will be talking about IAM, Identity and Access Management in AWS. So our typical structure for Trek 10 and clients and others that we work with is this. So we have a master IAM account, which is where everyone logs into. And then we'll have a sandbox account, a dev account, a prod account, and then other accounts for clients, right? So since we're in professional services, we're managing, maybe 50, 100, 200 accounts, because if a client has a dev, a sandbox, a prod, it gets really out of hand. So this is our default structure. So I would log into the IAM account, and then if I want credentials, I have to assume a role over to another account. So that just gives us separation of concerns, right? So if I need to limit my access or a colleague's access, I can give them what they need specifically to those accounts and not any others. And then we don't have anything living in that IAM account, so there are no resources, right? It's just groups and policies and things like that. So here are our roles that we use. So we have a read-only, a working, a power user, a manager, and a kernel role. So read-only is for things like a prod mostly, or if we're going into an account for discovery. So it's pretty much the default AWS managed policy for read-only access, but then we have a custom policy called deny sensitive reads, which I'll cover in another slide. Working has read-only and then power user, but you can't delete anything. Power user has read-only and power user, but you can delete some stuff. And then manager and kernel are much more powerful. So kernel, you can do anything you want. So if you have to make changes to IAM and things for the client, then you would get that account. We also break people up into groups. So we have tourist, climber, trekker, guide, and Sherpa. So a tourist is usually someone new coming in, and this person will have full access to Sandbox, so they can play around, but they can't break anything. And then as you're at the account or as you're at Trek 10 longer, or if your position changes, things like that, you can kind of move across. So this allows us to put people in those roles. Since everyone is pretty focused on building stuff, most people have more than read-only access. And then Sherpa allows people to, they're basically top-level people who can place people in those other groups. And then guide is for our elevation system. So if I need to elevate someone, I would need to be in the guide role to actually give them access to other accounts. So deny sensitive reads is a policy that not necessarily we invented, but one that we use. And so the default AWS read-only policy gives you read-only to everything. So that's anything in an S3 bucket, that's any ECR image that you have, that's anything in Dynamo, and you could have sensitive information in there, right? So if we're accessing a client's prod account, and we don't necessarily need to see what is in the table to do our job, or we don't need to download those files from S3. So for read-only, we apply these deny sensitive reads to a couple of those different policies. But that's just something to think about, because read-only gives you exactly that, read-only to everything. So this is not necessarily easy, but this is an older version of it, but some of the things we don't let you read. So Kinesis records, IoT shadows, things like that. Another thing that we do at Trek 10 is we have MFA enabled for everyone, and it's required to gain any sort of access. So if I can log into the console without MFA the first time, and that will allow me to set up my MFA device. That's it. That's the only thing I can do. So other than that, you need MFA for anything. Excuse me. And so this just, we use a console tool, which I'll go into later, AWSume, that also has that set up. So MFA across the board for everyone, and We also usually set this up for clients and things like that as well. So escalations. We used to have a pretty manual process at Trek 10 for escalating users. So if I needed the kernel role in an account, then I would have to say, hey, James, I need kernel for 5 hours, or I need kernel for the max of 500 hours. And a lot of times we would just request 500 hours because you don't want to have to keep bothering someone, multiple times a week and stuff. So we created a Slack bot that allows us to request access. So you can request for an hour to 500 hours. This will go to anyone in that guide group that I showed earlier. So it just chooses a person that's online in Slack from that group, and then it'll say, hey, Ken needs access to this client for this many hours, and then it will give you the short little thing that you need to copy into our console app, and you just copy that in, and then you run it, and then you can escalate the person. So this has made things a lot easier. People aren't asking for 500 hours anymore unless they're on the client for a really long time, things like that. And then we have a background job that goes through, and then it will remove those expired credentials from a user's policy. So the tool that we created, it used to be a little bash script, but now you can install it via Python. It's way better than it used to be. I don't know if anyone uses it here. But I'll show a demo on that. And then AWSume also has a plugin system. So we use GraphQL, which is a hosted GraphQL. We started using this before AWS AppSync came out. However, I created a little demo to show today. We're not going to use it, but I have all the code for it. You can set everything up in AppSync, and it will use your default IAM credentials so that you can list out any of the accounts that you have. So if you only have maybe 5 accounts for your company, that's not a lot. You could manually put those in the credentials and config file, and it's pretty easy to manage. However, if you have 200 or 500, right, that's a large file to manage if anything changes. So we use this so that we can just say, all right, list them out, or give me this client account, and then I'll assume into that. So before I go into the demo, I'll just go ahead and finish this. Here's your basic credential file, how it looks in the .aws folder. So you have your access key and your secret access key. However, what you would set up in the credential file, if you're not using one of the plugins, then you would manually set up another one. So you're a super awesome company. So then you would put the key in there for that, for the IAM account, or whatever your root login account is, and then AWSume can read this and then give you the credentials to the other accounts. And then here's what a config would look like. So your second profile, client1-admin, right, or client2-admin, or working or read-only. You set up the source profile, your MFA device, and then the role that you're wanting to assume into. So the AppSync example uses the AWS signature v4 signing to kind of reach out to AppSync, and then we'll go into that. So resources, we have a blog post on all this if you want to follow up that later on the trek10.com blog. We have one on AWSume, IAM, and then there is AWSume on GitHub. And then, as I said earlier, we are hiring. So let's see if I can make this more viewable. So I just have a little Vagrant box set up here. So I'm just installing the AWS CLI and then requests. Oh no, where'd you go? And then I don't care if you guys steal these keys, I'm going to delete them afterward, and you can only log in. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention, we have a VPN only policy. So the only way that you can assume a role or get into a client account is if you're on the Trek 10 VPN. So I'll delete these keys after, but if you steal them, we're still going to be okay. So I've got a little config set up here. So this is how you would set up your config. And then credentials, I've got my secret key and access key. And then I've also got the setup files for the AWSume plugins. So if we jump over here, so we've got the plugins.json. We have a console plugin, and then the GraphQL plugin. So you just have to install these in the plugins file, and then you can run it with AWSume, and it goes in there and looks for everything. So I think we're already in here. So it's pretty easy to install, assuming you have requests isn't necessary for AWSume, but it is required for the plugins, so that's why I already pre-installed it. So we'll just do pip3 install AWSume. Cool. Well, this is going really well. So in the meantime, you can see just at Trek 10, everything worked last night. Cool. Well, I don't really know what's going on. Well, I mean, it should just work by popping up a new one. But my Python environment broke yesterday, so. All right, here we go. All right, so now we have AWSume and requests installed. So now I can look for all the Trek 10 profiles. So AWSume-L will list everything in your local profile, so in the basic credentials and config setup. However, we also have the plugin, so it reaches out and it will look for everything that we have in our GraphQL account. So you can see, all these ones that we have set up. And if I want to get into a role, oops, sorry. So I got to get my MFA token. Access denied, right? So if I hop on the VPN, now I can gain access, right? So now I can do all of my calls as this user. So you can see that I'm now in our sandbox account. I have an assumed role of Trek 10 kernel, and I have a session name. If I want to escalate, then I just post in my request using our // command, and then it will send it to a user, and it'll kind of walk through this process. So this is one of my colleagues named Rob, and he may or may not respond. So if he doesn't, then it just jumps to the next person in the list. He can deny it. He can say I'm busy so that it'll move on a little more quickly, or he can accept it. But that's kind of it for the basics of AWSume. And then we also have this AppSync setup that I created. So if you're not familiar with AppSync, it's AWS's hosted GraphQL service. So you can have it reach out to Elasticsearch, you can have it reach out to DynamoDB, or it can use Lambda as a custom resolver to do a couple different things. So a simple little setup is to have one Dynamo table, and this will hold your account list. So, sandbox, dev, prod, other clients, whatever. And then you'll need a service role for AppSync. You'll need to create the AppSync API. You then create a table data source, and then you have a schema for that account list. So just an account is an ID and a name. That's really all we needed. And then a query to get account or list accounts. And then you create a data resolver. And then here in the plugin, it's just a pretty simple Python file, right? So we've got about 235 lines. So you determine your valid roles. So for us, read-only, working, power user, manager, kernel. You set up your company information, your path, what you want your default region to be, and a couple different things. And then this will basically configure AppSync. It'll log you in using your IAM credentials. It reaches out to the AppSync URL that you provide. And then you can just list everything from Dynamo and AppSync. That's pretty much it. We get a lot more complicated. We do some enterprise landing zone stuff. But this is our basic overall IAM setup. There's a question back there. Yes, yes. So actually for us, we set a lot of our stuff up before AWS organizations come out, but we do that now. We've kind of migrated some things over. We actually kill our sandbox every quarter, and so we can kill that. And so we've started rolling stuff under organizations as well. Yeah, I think that's it. So are there any questions? Another one? Sorry, say again. Yes, we use CloudFormation.
Actually, can you repeat the question for the recording?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the question was, how do we manage the policies themselves? So we have CloudFormation set up with all of that. We use GitLab, and then if someone makes a change to the policy, then it'll deploy it into we have a sandbox account for this as well, and then it kind of will just run through our pipeline. Also, another thing we do is we deploy all of these policies into a region we do not use. So I think for us, everything is deployed into Sydney. All these CloudFormation templates, because IAM is a global resource, right? But if someone is in there for whatever reason, messing with things or looking at things, it's harder to see or less easy to delete because it's in a different region. Does that answer? Okay. Anyone else?
I have a question. Do you have automated tests around the setup and kind of auditing of the roles and permissions that you're granting?
That's a good question. I'll have to follow up. I haven't worked on the system itself, so I'll have to ask. But I know we have a couple people that work on that and go through it all. So.
Oh, we got a question in the back.
Yeah, so for your top-level IAM account, is that used exclusively for, I guess, those CloudFormation templates and then those IAM credentials? You don't have any other server resources really in that top-level account?
Yeah, so the question is about the top-level IAM account, and I'll just go ahead and bring this up. So the question was, what resources are in there if we have anything? So no, we don't have anything but the users and the groups and policies in there. So we don't have any Dynamo tables. We don't have any API gateway resources. So you can't create anything in there. The only thing you can do is assume a role to another account and list out your personal user. Unless you're one of the Sherpas, then you can kind of move people around in their groups. But yeah, those are the only things that live in that account.
Any other questions for Ken?
So to follow up on Calvin's question, we don't have any automated testing on the the policy process and everything. So we use some chain sets and stuff, but only a couple people have access, so we don't automate it that.
You're going through the approval process with Slack. Is that automated somehow so that you can go back and say, this person authorized me to access this? You are capturing those logs so that if one of your clients goes, well, who did that?
Good question. So the question was, is all of the escalation audited in some way or tracked? Yes, we use CloudTrail to audit everything, and then we also have an audit log in Slack as well. So every time an escalation is approved, then it pushes everything into Slack. Watchdog? Datadog.
All right, Steve.
How do you do, you say you can expire escalations. How is that actually accomplished? How do you dictate when to expire it?
So when we put the policy in, it has a life cycle, and then we just have a background Lambda that will go through and clean up any expired ones that have not been removed.
So is it just like buried in the description of the IAM policy?
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you actually do it.
I'll have to follow up. I'll follow up with you on that if you get with me after this.
All right, any other questions?